My 3 adult children showed up at my door with legal papers demanding I sign over my house, claiming I was mentally unfit to own property. What they didn't know was that I'd already sold it 2 weeks earlier to their abusive stepfather, the man they'd spent 20 years trying to escape from. I'm Judith Reeves, and at 64 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting here telling you about the day my own children tried to steal my home from under me. But that's exactly what happened on a scorching Tuesday morning in Phoenix, Arizona, when everything I thought I knew about my family came crashing down around me. You see, 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. The doctor sat me down in his sterile office and explained that while I was still fully functional and could live independently for years, my memory might start showing some gaps, and my decision-making could become compromised over time. He used that word specifically, compromised, like I was some kind of security breach waiting to happen. I walked out of that appointment feeling like my world had shifted on its axis. Not because I was afraid of the disease. My grandmother had lived with dementia for 8 years and still maintained her dignity and humor until the very end. No, I was afraid because I knew exactly what that diagnosis would mean to my 3 children, Trevor, Natasha, and Quinn. See, my kids haven't exactly been the poster children for family devotion over the past few years. Ever since their father died 5 years ago, their visits have become increasingly sparse and transparently motivated by financial concerns. They'd show up around holidays or my birthday, spend exactly enough time to seem caring, and then inevitably steer the conversation toward my future plans and whether I'd thought about updating my will. It should have been a red flag when they started asking about my finances more than my health, my property value more than my well-being. But like most mothers, I made excuses for their behavior. They were busy with their own lives, their own families, their own struggles. They were just being practical, thinking ahead, wanting to make sure I was taken care of. I was such a fool. The irony is that my house, a beautiful 4-bedroom adobe-style home in one of Phoenix's most desirable neighborhoods, had become worth almost 3 times what my late husband Carl and I paid for it 30 years ago. The desert views, the mature landscaping, the custom tile work that Carl had installed himself during our early years of marriage, all of it had turned into a gold mine that my children could apparently smell from their respective homes across the city. But here's what they didn't know about their confused and compromised mother. I've been playing chess while they've been playing checkers. The morning they showed up with their lawyer and their papers and their carefully rehearsed concerned expressions, I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the hummingbirds at my feeder, just like I do every morning. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m., early enough to catch me before I was fully alert, as they'd probably calculated. I opened the door to find all 3 of them standing there in what I can only describe as their funeral clothes, dark, serious outfits that said, "We're here on solemn business." Trevor, my oldest, was wearing a suit I'd never seen before. Natasha had her hair pulled back in that severe bun she wore to court hearings for her divorce proceedings, and Quinn, my baby, couldn't even meet my eyes. "Hi, Mom," Trevor said, his voice artificially gentle, like he was talking to a child. "We need to come in and have a serious conversation with you." Behind them stood a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s, briefcase, expression that screamed legal professional. This wasn't a family visit. This was an ambush. "Of course, come in," I said, playing the role they expected. "Let me put on some coffee. You know how I get confused when I don't have my caffeine." I watched their faces as I said that word, confused. I saw the quick glances they exchanged, the subtle nods of confirmation. See? Mom admits she gets confused. This is going to be easier than we thought. They settled into my living room like a tribunal. The lawyer, who introduced herself as Patricia Brennan, family law specialist, pulled out a thick folder of documents. Trevor positioned himself in Carl's old recliner, claiming the seat of authority. Natasha perched on the edge of the couch, ready to spring into action. Quinn hung back by the window, still avoiding eye contact. "Mom," Trevor began, using that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "We've been talking, and we're worried about you. Really worried." "Worried about what, honey?" I asked, settling into my own chair and arranging my face into an expression of mild confusion. "About your health, your safety, your ability to make important decisions," Natasha jumped in. "We know about the diagnosis, Mom. Dr. Henderson's office called us because you listed us as emergency contacts." That was a lie, and I knew it. I'd specifically told Dr. Henderson not to discuss my medical information with anyone, but I let it slide, curious to see where this performance was heading. "We think it might be time to consider some changes," Trevor continued. "Some adjustments to help ensure you're protected and taken care of." Patricia the lawyer opened her briefcase and spread documents across my coffee table like she was dealing cards. "Mrs. Reeves, your children have petitioned the court for guardianship proceedings. They're concerned that your cognitive decline has reached a point where you might be vulnerable to exploitation or poor decision-making." I stared at the papers, official-looking documents with legal seals and formal language that basically said my own children wanted to declare me mentally incompetent. They wanted to take control of my finances, my property, my entire life, and stick me in some care facility where I'd be safely out of the way while they liquidated my assets. "This is for your own good, Mom," Natasha said, reaching over to pat my hand. "We found a lovely assisted living community with full medical support. You'd have your own apartment, activities, people to take care of you around the clock." "And what happens to my house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, obviously you won't need it anymore," Trevor said. "We'd put it on the market and use the proceeds to pay for your care. Whatever's left would go into a trust for your future needs. A trust that they would control, a trust that would conveniently be depleted by administrative fees and care costs until there was nothing left but empty promises and their hollow expressions of love." I looked around my living room, at the hand-painted tiles Carl and I had chosen together, at the built-in bookshelves where I'd displayed 30 years of family photos, at the sliding glass doors that opened onto the patio where we'd hosted countless birthday parties and holiday gatherings. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of my entire adult life, and my children wanted to sell it like it was nothing more than a stock portfolio. "I need some time to think about this," I said carefully. "Mom, there's really nothing to think about," Trevor said, his patience already wearing thin. "The papers are already filed. The court date is set for next month. This is just a formality. We're trying to make this as easy as possible for everyone." A formality. They'd already decided my fate without consulting me, and now they were just going through the motions of pretending I had a choice. That's when Patricia the lawyer leaned forward with a pen and pointed to a signature line. "If you sign the voluntary guardianship agreement today, we can avoid the court proceedings entirely. It would be much less stressful for everyone involved." Less stressful for them, she meant. Less chance for me to fight back or expose their scheme. I took the pen and held it for a long moment, letting them think I was considering their generous offer. Trevor leaned back in Carl's chair, already counting his inheritance. Natasha was practically vibrating with anticipation. Even Quinn had finally looked up from the window, probably calculating his share of the house proceeds. "You know," I said slowly, "there's something I should probably tell you before I sign anything." "What's that, Mom?" Trevor asked, his voice dripping with false concern. I set down the pen and looked each of them in the eye. These 3 people I'd carried in my body, raised with love and sacrifice, supported through every challenge, and celebrated through every achievement. I sold the house 2 weeks ago. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the hummingbirds outside. 3 faces stared at me with identical expressions of shock and disbelief. "What do you mean you sold it?" Natasha whispered. "I mean I signed a sales contract, accepted payment, and transferred ownership to the new buyer. The escrow closed yesterday." Trevor shot to his feet so fast he nearly knocked over Carl's recliner. "That's impossible. You can't make major financial decisions without—" "Without what, honey? Without your permission. I hate to break it to you, but I'm still mentally competent enough to sell my own property." "Who bought it?" Quinn asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "Who did you sell it to?" I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "Raymond," I said simply. The color drained from all 3 faces simultaneously. Patricia, the lawyer, looked confused, but my children understood exactly who Raymond was and what his ownership of this house meant for their future. Raymond Kellman, their stepfather, the man who'd made their teenage years a living hell. The man I'd finally divorced 15 years ago, after he'd spent a decade terrorizing my family. The man they'd spent the last 2 decades trying to forget existed. And now he owned the house where they'd grown up, where they'd planned to profit from my decline, where they'd assumed they could control my destiny. "You didn't," Natasha breathed. "Oh, but I did," I said, standing up and gathering their legal papers into a neat pile. "And you know what the best part is? He paid cash, above asking price, and he's very excited about moving back into his old family home." The hook wasn't just about the sale. It was about the realization that their greed had delivered them straight into the hands of the man they feared most. And I was just getting started. To understand how we arrived at that moment of devastating revelation in my living room, I need to take you back 3 months, to the day everything started unraveling, or maybe finally started making sense. It was a typical Phoenix morning in late January, the kind where the desert sun streams through your windows and makes you forget that winter exists anywhere in the world. I was getting ready for what I thought would be a routine doctor's appointment, the kind of medical checkup that becomes increasingly frequent once you pass 60. Dr. Henderson had called the previous week asking me to come in to discuss some test results, and his tone had been carefully neutral, in that way doctors learn to master when they're about to deliver life-changing news. I'd been living alone in my 4-bedroom adobe house for 5 years, ever since my husband Carl passed away from a heart attack while working in our garden. The house sits on 2 acres in the foothills of Phoenix, with panoramic views of the Sonoran Desert that Carl and I fell in love with when we first moved to Arizona 31 years ago. We'd bought it as young parents, drawn by the excellent schools and the space for our growing family to spread out and thrive. Carl had been a contractor, specializing in custom homes, and over the years he'd transformed our property into something that belonged in Architectural Digest. Hand-painted Mexican tiles throughout the kitchen and bathrooms, custom built-in entertainment centers and bookshelves, a master suite with vaulted ceilings and sliding glass doors that opened onto a private patio overlooking the desert, an infinity pool that seemed to blend seamlessly into the horizon during sunset. But more than the physical beauty, this house held 30 years of family history. The growth chart penciled onto the back of the pantry door, documenting Trevor, Natasha, and Quinn's height, from toddlers to teenagers. The dent in the hallway wall from the time Quinn crashed his bike indoors during a thunderstorm. The kitchen island where I'd helped with countless homework assignments and listened to teenage heartbreaks and celebrated college acceptances. After Carl died, people kept asking if I planned to downsize to find something more manageable for a widow living alone. But this house wasn't just my home. It was my connection to the life we'd built together, the place where I felt closest to his memory. Besides, I was perfectly capable of maintaining it with the help of a landscaping service and a weekly housekeeper. My children had different opinions about my living situation. Trevor, my oldest, lived about 20 minutes away in a trendy Scottsdale neighborhood with his wife Melissa and their twin daughters. He worked in commercial real estate and had been increasingly vocal about what he called my impractical attachment to such a large property. "Mom, you're rattling around in that huge house like a marble in a shoebox," he'd say during his monthly duty visits. "Think about how much easier your life would be in a nice condo somewhere." Natasha, my middle child, was going through a bitter divorce and had recently moved back to Phoenix from California with her teenage son Javier. She'd been staying in a cramped apartment while fighting her ex-husband over custody and support, and I could see the way she looked at my house, not with nostalgia or warmth, but with calculation. She'd started making comments about wasted space and unused bedrooms that could be put to better use. Quinn, my youngest at 26, was struggling to establish himself as a freelance graphic designer while living in a studio apartment and driving a car that was older than his relationship with his girlfriend Amber. He'd never directly asked about inheritance or my will, but he'd started bringing up stories about friends whose grandparents had smart estate planning that helped the whole family. The warning signs had been there for months, but I dismissed them as natural concern for my well-being. It wasn't until Dr. Henderson sat me down in his office that Tuesday morning and explained my test results that I understood what I was really dealing with. "The cognitive assessments show some mild impairment, consistent with early-stage dementia," he said gently. "It's not severe, and you're still fully capable of independent living, but there may be some memory gaps, some difficulty with complex decision-making as time goes on." I felt like the floor had shifted beneath me. Not because the diagnosis was unexpected. I'd noticed small changes, moments of confusion, times when familiar words seemed to slip away from me like water through my fingers. But because I immediately understood what this diagnosis would mean to my children. "How long do I have before—" I couldn't finish the question. "Mrs. Reeves, every case is different. Some people live with mild symptoms for years, even decades. Others progress more quickly. The important thing is that you're still sharp, still capable, still very much yourself. This is a beginning, not an ending." But I knew it would feel like an ending to Trevor, Natasha, and Quinn. It would feel like an opportunity. Dr. Henderson suggested I might want to discuss my future plans with family members, maybe consider powers of attorney for health care and finances, just to be prepared. He meant well, but I could already imagine how that conversation would go with my children. I drove home from that appointment, feeling like I was seeing my life through a different lens. The house that had always felt like a sanctuary suddenly felt like a target. The financial security that Carl's life insurance and careful planning had provided suddenly felt like a prize waiting to be claimed. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to my children's behavior during their visits. Trevor would walk through the house like he was conducting an appraisal, commenting on needed repairs or upgrades. "The roof's going to need work soon, Mom. These tiles are probably 20 years old." Or, "Have you thought about updating this kitchen? These appliances are ancient." Natasha began asking detailed questions about my finances. "Mom, do you have enough saved for long-term care if you need it? Have you looked into those insurance policies that cover assisted living?" When I assured her I was financially secure, she'd press for specifics. "But what if you need specialized memory care? That can cost $6,000 a month or more." Quinn's approach was more subtle but equally concerning. He'd bring up news stories about elderly people being scammed or taken advantage of. "Did you see that story about the old lady who gave her whole savings to some guy who called pretending to be her grandson? It's so scary how people target seniors, especially ones who might be getting a little confused." The message was clear. I was vulnerable. I was becoming unreliable, and I needed their protection from my own poor judgment. But here's what they didn't know about their supposedly declining mother. I'd spent 40 years married to a contractor who dealt with some of the shrewdest business people in Arizona. I'd helped Carl negotiate deals, manage crews, and handle finances for his company. I might have early-stage dementia, but I still had decades of experience reading people and recognizing when someone was trying to manipulate me. So I started doing my own research. I looked into guardianship laws in Arizona and discovered exactly how easy it would be for adult children to have their parent declared incompetent. I researched the assisted living facilities in the area and found out what they really cost versus what they claimed to provide. I even hired a private investigator to look into my children's financial situations, and what I discovered was enlightening. Trevor's real estate business was struggling more than he'd admitted. He'd overextended himself on several investment properties and was facing significant debt. Natasha's divorce was proving more expensive than expected, and her ex-husband's business had tanked, leaving her with minimal support payments. Quinn's freelance work was sporadic at best, and he'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years. They weren't concerned about my well-being. They were concerned about their inheritance timeline. That's when I started making my own plans. I reached out to several real estate agents to get current market valuations on my property. The numbers were staggering. My house was now worth almost $2 million, thanks to the desert location and Carl's custom work. I consulted with an estate planning attorney who wasn't connected to my children in any way, someone who could give me unbiased advice about protecting my assets and my autonomy. And then, in a moment of what my children would probably call dementia-induced poor judgment, I made a phone call I hadn't made in 15 years. I called Raymond Kellman, my ex-husband, the man who'd made my children's lives miserable for nearly a decade before I finally found the courage to divorce him. Raymond had been calling me sporadically since Carl's death, claiming he wanted to reconnect and make amends for the past. I'd been ignoring his calls, but suddenly I saw an opportunity that was too perfect to pass up. "Judith," he said when he answered, his voice carrying that familiar tone of manufactured charm. "I've been hoping you'd call me back." "Hello, Raymond," I said carefully. "I've been thinking about our last conversation, about you wanting to help me during this difficult time." "Of course, sweetheart. You know I still care about you, despite everything that happened between us. We're family, in a way. Family." The word tasted bitter, but I forced myself to continue. "I might need that help sooner than I expected. Could we meet for lunch tomorrow? I have something important to discuss with you." And that's how I set in motion the most calculated decision of my life, a decision that would teach my children exactly what happened when greed overtook love, when inheritance mattered more than family, when they mistook their mother's illness for weakness. Raymond had no idea he was about to become the unwitting star of my revenge plot, and my children had no idea that their supposedly confused mother was about to outmaneuver them in ways they never saw coming. The month following my lunch meeting with Raymond was like watching a carefully orchestrated symphony of deception unfold, except I was the only one who could see the conductor's baton waving. My children had no idea that their concerned visits and subtle manipulations were being catalogued and analyzed by someone who was far more mentally sharp than they assumed. Every patronizing comment, every helpful suggestion, every attempt to undermine my confidence was adding fuel to a fire they couldn't see burning. It started with Trevor showing up unannounced on a Thursday morning, claiming he'd been in the neighborhood for a property showing. He wandered through my house like an appraiser, making notes on his phone and commenting on things that had never bothered him before. "Mom, this sliding door track is really sticking," he said, forcing the patio door open and closed repeatedly. That's a safety hazard. What if you needed to get out quickly and couldn't manage the door? I watched him document the hazard on his phone, probably building a case for why I was living in unsafe conditions. It sticks sometimes when the weather changes, I said mildly. Your father always said these old tracks just need a little WD-40. Dad's been gone for 5 years, Mom. You can't keep relying on his old solutions for everything. Trevor's voice carried that edge of impatience that had been creeping into our conversations more frequently. Have you thought about what would happen if you fell and couldn't get to a phone? If you got confused and wandered outside at night? If someone took advantage of your condition? There it was. My condition. Not my health, not my diagnosis, but my condition. Like I was a house with structural problems that needed immediate attention. I'm managing just fine, Trevor, I said, but he was already moving on to the kitchen, opening cabinets and shaking his head at the cleaning supplies stored under the sink. These chemicals should be locked up, he muttered, taking more pictures. Someone with memory issues shouldn't have access to dangerous substances. Dangerous substances. My everyday cleaning supplies had become evidence of my incompetence. 2 days later, Natasha arrived with her son Javier, ostensibly for a family visit. But while Javier played video games in the living room, Natasha cornered me in the kitchen with a folder full of printed articles. Mom, I've been researching your diagnosis, and I found some really informative pieces about early intervention and safety planning. She spread the papers across my counter like she was presenting a legal case. This one talks about how people with dementia often don't recognize when they're making poor decisions. They think they're fine, but their judgment is actually severely compromised. I scanned the articles, all carefully chosen to paint a picture of inevitable decline and dangerous incompetence. These are very thorough, I said carefully. I also printed out some information about assisted living communities that specialize in memory care. She pulled out a stack of glossy brochures. Look at this one, Desert Springs Manor. They have secured units, 24-hour medical staff, and structured activities designed specifically for people with cognitive impairment. Secured units. She was talking about locking me up. The best part is that they handle all the financial management too, Natasha continued. Residents don't have to worry about paying bills or making investment decisions. Everything is taken care of by professional staff. What happens to their assets? I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly where this conversation was headed. Well, the facility fees are paid first, obviously, and then family members can be appointed as financial guardians to manage any remaining assets for the residents' benefit. She said this like she was doing me an enormous favor. It takes all the stress and responsibility off the patient. Patient. I'd gone from being her mother to being a patient who needed management. Natasha, I appreciate your research, but I'm not ready to give up my independence yet. Her face tightened with frustration. Mom, that's exactly what the articles are talking about. People with your condition often resist help even when they desperately need it. They can't see how impaired their judgment has become. The circular logic was perfect. If I agreed with their assessment, I was acknowledging my incompetence. If I disagreed, that was proof of my compromised judgment. Either way, I lost. Quinn's approach was more emotional, but equally calculated. He started visiting twice a week, always with some story about a friend or co-worker whose elderly relative had been taken advantage of by scammers or predators. My buddy Jake's grandmother just lost $30,000 to some guy who called claiming to be her grandson in jail, he told me one evening as we sat on my patio watching the sunset. She was so confused, she actually went to the bank and wired the money before anyone could stop her. That's terrible, I said, and I meant it. But I could see where this was going. The worst part is, she seemed totally normal most of the time. Her family had no idea how vulnerable she was until it was too late. Quinn looked at me with what I'm sure he thought was subtle concern. It makes me worry about you, Mom. Living alone, managing your own finances, dealing with people who might try to manipulate you. What kind of people would try to manipulate me, honey? I don't know. Contractors, salespeople, even people claiming to be old friends who just want to reconnect. His voice dropped to a whisper. Has anyone like that been contacting you lately? I almost laughed. Quinn was fishing to see if I'd mentioned Raymond's calls, probably hoping to use any contact with my ex-husband as evidence of my poor judgment. No one's been trying to scam me if that's what you're worried about, I said. But would you even recognize it if they were? I mean, these people are really sophisticated. They know exactly how to target people who might be having memory problems. The implications were clear. I couldn't trust my own judgment about people's intentions. I was a sitting duck waiting to be plucked by anyone clever enough to exploit my condition. But the final straw came during what was supposed to be a family dinner the following Sunday. All 3 children had coordinated their visit, bringing their own families to what felt like an intervention disguised as a social gathering. I'd spent hours preparing their favorite dishes, Trevor's beloved enchiladas, Natasha's requested sopapillas, Quinn's must-have guacamole made from my grandmother's recipe. I'd set the table with my good china and arranged fresh flowers from my garden as a centerpiece. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The grandchildren played in the pool, while the adults caught up on work and school and neighborhood gossip. I started to think maybe I'd been paranoid. Maybe their recent behavior had been genuine concern rather than calculated manipulation. Then Trevor's wife Melissa made a comment that changed everything. "Judith, this house is just stunning," she said as we cleared the dinner dishes. "But it must be so much work to maintain. Don't you ever think about simplifying your life?" Before I could answer, Natasha jumped in. "We've been talking about that with Mom. There are so many beautiful retirement communities now, places where she wouldn't have to worry about yard work or repairs or any of the stressful parts of homeownership. Plus the safety factor," Trevor added, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "Mom had a little incident last week where she got confused about her medication schedule. Nothing serious, but it made us realize how important it is to have professional supervision." I stared at him. There had been no incident with my medication. I kept my pills in a weekly organizer and had never missed a dose or taken anything incorrectly. He'd just lied to his wife about my competence, right in front of me. "I don't remember any confusion about my medication," I said carefully. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Trevor said, his voice taking on that patient, patronizing tone that made my blood pressure spike. "You don't remember because that's how this disease works. The memory gaps make it impossible to accurately assess your own capabilities." Quinn appeared behind his brother, nodding solemnly. "We're not trying to gang up on you, Mom. We're trying to protect you from situations that could be dangerous." "What kind of situations?" "Well, like financial decisions," Natasha said. "People with cognitive impairment are incredibly vulnerable to making poor choices about money. They might sell their house to the wrong person or trust someone who doesn't have their best interests at heart." There it was. The real concern wasn't my safety or my health. It was the possibility that I might dispose of my assets in ways they didn't approve of. "Who would I sell my house to that you'd consider the wrong person?" I asked. The 3 of them exchanged glances, and I could practically see the telepathic conversation happening between them. "Mom," Trevor said slowly, "we know that Raymond has been calling you." My heart stopped. They'd been monitoring my phone calls. "We're not spying on you," Natasha added quickly, reading my expression. "But Javier heard you mention his name when he was visiting last week, and we got concerned." "Raymond heard us, Mom," Quinn said. his voice cracking slightly. "He hurt all of us. The idea of him trying to worm his way back into your life when you're vulnerable. He can't be trusted," Trevor said firmly. "And the fact that you're even considering having contact with him proves that your judgment is compromised." I looked around my kitchen at these 3 adults I'd raised with love and sacrifice, who were now using my illness as justification to control every aspect of my life. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting their inheritance from their stepfather, the man they were terrified might manipulate me into changing my will. "So, what are you suggesting?" I asked. "We think it's time to make some legal arrangements," Trevor said, pulling a business card from his wallet. "Patricia Brennan specializes in family law and elder care issues. She can help us set up a guardianship that would protect you from making any decisions that might not be in your best interest." Guardianship. The word hung in the air like a threat. "It's not about taking away your freedom," Natasha insisted. "It's about making sure you have support and guidance for the important stuff." "What would happen to my house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We'd probably need to sell it," Quinn admitted. "The equity could pay for your care for years, and you'd be safe and supervised in a place designed for people with your needs." Safe and supervised, like a prisoner with better amenities. That night, after they'd all gone home with their leftovers and their satisfied expressions, I sat in my living room and made the phone call that would change everything. "Raymond," I said when he answered, "are you still interested in buying my house?" "More than ever, sweetheart," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "When do you want to close?" My children thought they were protecting themselves from Raymond's influence. They had no idea they were about to hand him the perfect weapon to use against them, and I was about to give him the keys to their worst nightmare. The 2 weeks between my phone call to Raymond and the morning my children arrived with their legal papers were the most strategically intense 14 days of my life. Every conversation, every decision, every signature was calculated to perfection, like I was playing 3-dimensional chess while my opponents were still figuring out how the pieces moved. Raymond had been surprisingly easy to work with, which should have been my first warning that he had his own agenda. But at that point, I was so focused on outmaneuvering my children that I didn't stop to consider what my ex-husband might be planning beyond our immediate transaction. "I can have the cash ready in 72 hours, he'd told me during our first meeting at a coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale. He looked older than I remembered. Grayer hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but that calculating intelligence was still there, sharp as ever. "No financing contingencies, no inspection periods, no delays. We can close by the end of next week if you want." "Why are you so eager to buy my house, Raymond?" I asked, studying his face for clues. "After all these years, why this house? Why now?" He leaned back in his chair and smiled that smile I remembered so well, part charm, part predator. "Let's just say I have fond memories of the place. And I know how much it means to you. I'd hate to see it go to strangers who wouldn't appreciate its history." The way he said history made my skin crawl, but I pushed aside my discomfort. This wasn't about Raymond's motives. This was about teaching my children a lesson they'd never forget. "I want to be very clear about something," I said. "This sale has nothing to do with reconciliation or getting back together. This is a business transaction, period." "Of course, Judith. I wouldn't dream of imposing on your independence." But his eyes said something entirely different, and I felt a flicker of unease about what I was setting in motion. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, inspections, and legal procedures. Raymond brought his own real estate agent, a sharp-dressed man named Marcus Delacroix, who seemed to specialize in rapid cash transactions. They waived the standard inspection period, accepted the house as is, and offered me $50,000 over asking price. Your ex-husband must really want this property, Marcus commented as we signed the initial contracts. I've never seen someone so eager to close quickly without any contingencies. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why Raymond was willing to pay premium prices for a house he could have fought for in our divorce 15 years earlier. I should have considered what his long-term plans might be beyond simply owning my family home. But I was intoxicated by the thought of my children's faces when they discovered what I'd done. I was drunk on the anticipation of their shock, their horror, their realization that they'd underestimated their supposedly declining mother. Meanwhile, my children continued their campaign of subtle intimidation, completely unaware that their window of opportunity was closing with each passing day. Trevor called Wednesday morning to check in and casually mentioned that he'd driven by my house the previous evening. I noticed some lights were on kind of late, Mom. Everything okay? You're not having trouble sleeping, are you? He was monitoring my daily routines now, probably building a case about irregular behavior patterns that could support their guardianship petition. I was just reading in bed, I told him. Nothing unusual. Reading what? The question caught me off guard. Excuse me? What were you reading? I know you sometimes get confused about things you've read, and I want to make sure you're not dwelling on anything upsetting. He was questioning my choice of books now, like I might accidentally read something that would damage my fragile mental state. I was reading a mystery novel, Trevor. Nothing that would upset anyone. Okay, good. Just remember that Patricia Brennan wants to meet with you next week to go over the guardianship paperwork. It's really just a formality at this point. The court date is already scheduled. A formality. They'd already decided my fate and were just going through the motions of pretending I had input. Thursday brought Natasha with a new tactic: emotional manipulation disguised as family bonding. She arrived with photo albums and asked if we could take a trip down memory lane together. I thought it might be nice to go through some old pictures before you move to your new place, she said, settling beside me on the couch with a box of family photos. Maybe we could pick out some special ones for you to take with you. Move to my new place. She was already talking about my relocation to assisted living like it was a foregone conclusion. We spent an hour looking through pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations, graduation ceremonies. Natasha provided commentary for each photo, but I noticed she was steering the conversation in specific directions. Look at this one from Quinn's high school graduation, she said, holding up a picture of our family gathered around my youngest son in his cap and gown. Remember how proud Dad was? How proud we all were of our family? Of course I remember. Do you think Dad would want us to stay close as a family? To take care of each other? Yes, I think he would. Then you understand why we're trying to help you now. Dad would want us to make sure you're safe and protected, even if that means making some difficult decisions. She was using Carl's memory as emotional leverage, suggesting that opposing their guardianship plan would be betraying my late husband's wishes for our family unity. Dad would also want me to maintain my dignity and independence as long as possible, I replied. But Mom, sometimes maintaining independence isn't realistic anymore. Sometimes the most loving thing family can do is step in and provide guidance. Guidance, another euphemism for control. Friday afternoon brought the most disturbing visit yet. Quinn arrived with Amber, his girlfriend, who I'd met only a handful of times over the past 2 years. But this wasn't a social call. Amber had apparently been recruited as an expert witness to my declining condition. Mrs. Reeves, Quinn told me about your diagnosis, Amber said with practiced sympathy. My grandmother went through something similar, so I understand how challenging this must be for your family. It's not that challenging, I said. I'm managing quite well. Of course you are, she agreed quickly. But Quinn mentioned that you've been having some episodes of confusion lately, like forgetting conversations or repeating yourself. I stared at my youngest son. What episodes of confusion? Quinn looked uncomfortable but pressed on. Mom, last week when I called you, you didn't remember that we'd talked the day before. And when I visited Tuesday, you asked me 3 times if I wanted coffee. These were complete fabrications. Quinn hadn't visited Tuesday, and I'd spoken to him exactly once the previous week. But here he was, lying about my mental state to his girlfriend, probably planning to have her testify about my incompetence if needed. I think you're misremembering those conversations, honey, I said carefully. See? Amber said, turning to Quinn with knowing eyes. That's exactly what my grandmother used to say. She'd forget things and then insist that everyone else was wrong about what happened. They'd rehearsed this. Quinn had coached his girlfriend to provide supporting testimony for their narrative of my declining mental state. That evening, after they'd left, I sat in my kitchen and realized that my children weren't just planning to steal my house and my independence. They were willing to gaslight me about my own experiences to justify their actions. They were so committed to their version of events that they'd started believing their own lies about my condition. The next morning, I drove to Raymond's lawyer's office and signed the final paperwork. The house sale was complete, the funds were transferred, and the deed was officially recorded in Raymond's name. I was no longer the owner of the property where I'd raised my family and lived for 3 decades, but I wasn't sad or regretful. I was energized by the thought of what came next. Monday morning, I called Trevor and told him I was ready to discuss their guardianship proposal. That's wonderful, Mom, he said, relief evident in his voice. Patricia can meet with us tomorrow morning. We'll come by around 9 to go over everything. Perfect, I said. I think it's time to resolve this situation once and for all. Tuesday morning, I woke up before dawn and made myself a pot of strong coffee. I dressed carefully in my best navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to Carl's funeral, the one that made me feel powerful and dignified. I styled my hair and put on the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. If this was going to be the performance of my lifetime, I wanted to look the part. At exactly 9 a.m., I heard 3 car doors slam in my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Trevor, Natasha, and Quinn walking toward my front door, followed by a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, Patricia Brennan, the lawyer who was supposed to help them steal my life. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. Good morning, I said with a smile. Come in. We have a lot to discuss. As they settled into my living room, Patricia spreading her papers across my coffee table like she was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game, I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced in months. They thought they were here to complete their takeover of my life. They had no idea they were about to walk into the most devastating revelation of their existence. I looked at each of my children, these 3 people I'd loved unconditionally for decades, who were now prepared to declare me incompetent for their own financial gain, and made my final decision. It was time to show them exactly what happened when you underestimated Judith Reeves. It was time to detonate the bomb I'd been building for 2 weeks. It was time to introduce them to their new landlord. The silence that followed my announcement about selling the house to Raymond was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had marked time through countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, and ordinary moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Patricia Brennan, the lawyer my children had brought to orchestrate my legal surrender, looked completely lost. She glanced between my children's horrified faces and her neat stack of guardianship papers as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I'm sorry, she said carefully, but did you just say you sold this house to someone named Raymond? 2 weeks ago, I confirmed, settling back into my chair with the satisfaction of watching 3 decades of careful parenting crumble in real time. The sale closed yesterday. As of this morning, I'm officially a tenant in Raymond Kellman's property. Trevor shot to his feet so violently that he knocked over his coffee cup, sending brown liquid spreading across Patricia's legal documents. "That's impossible. You can't make a decision like that without—" "Without what, honey?" I interrupted. "Without your permission? I hate to break it to you, but I'm still mentally competent enough to sell my own property to whoever I choose." "Raymond is our stepfather," Natasha whispered to Patricia, her face completely drained of color. He was abusive, psychologically abusive. We haven't spoken to him in 15 years. 16 years, Quinn corrected, his voice hollow. It's been 16 years since Mom divorced him. Patricia looked even more confused. "Mrs. Reeves, if this man was abusive to your family, why would you sell your house to him?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that Carl and I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Because, Patricia, my children have spent the last 3 months trying to convince me that I'm mentally incompetent, financially vulnerable, and incapable of making my own decisions. They've lied about my condition, fabricated episodes of confusion, and planned to have me declared legally incompetent so they could steal my house and stick me in a care facility." "That's not true," Natasha protested. "We're trying to protect you." I turned back to face them, and for the first time in months, I felt completely in control of my own life. "Protect me from what exactly? From making choices you don't approve of? From disposing of my assets in ways that don't benefit you? From making terrible decisions that could ruin your life?" Trevor exploded. "Like selling your house to a man who terrorized this family for 10 years. You want to talk about terrible decisions?" I walked back to my chair and picked up a folder I'd placed on the side table. "Let's talk about your financial situation, shall we?" I opened the folder and pulled out the private investigator's report I'd commissioned weeks earlier. "Trevor, your real estate business is 6 months behind on commercial loan payments. You've overextended yourself on 4 investment properties, and you're facing foreclosure on at least 2 of them." Trevor's face went from red to white in seconds. "How do you know that?" "Natasha, your divorce settlement was far less generous than you led me to believe. Your ex-husband's business failed, leaving you with minimal child support and significant legal bills. You're currently 3 months behind on your apartment rent." "Mom, stop," Natasha whispered. "And Quinn, my baby, you haven't had steady income in 8 months. You're living off credit cards and borrowed money from friends, and you've been lying to Amber about your financial situation, just like you've been lying to me about my mental state." The 3 of them stared at me like I'd just performed a magic trick they couldn't understand. "So, when you talk about protecting me from people who might take advantage of my vulnerability," I continued, "forgive me if I find that a little ironic, because the only people who have been trying to manipulate and exploit me are sitting right here in my living room." Patricia cleared her throat nervously. "Mrs. Reeves, even if your children's motives weren't entirely pure, selling your house to someone with a history of abuse seems like—" "Like what?" "Like something a mentally competent woman might do to teach her greedy children a lesson they'll never forget." I sat back down and smiled at them. "Oh, Patricia, this is just the beginning." I pulled out my phone and speed-dialed a number I'd programmed that morning. "Raymond? Yes, they're all here. Would you like to come over and discuss the lease arrangements with my children?" "No!" Quinn jumped up from his chair. "Mom, you can't let him come here. You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly what I'm doing. I'm introducing you to your new landlord." "Our new landlord?" Natasha's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" "Well, you're all going to need somewhere to live, aren't you? Trevor, when your house gets foreclosed next month, where were you planning to take Melissa and the twins? Natasha, when you get evicted from that apartment, where will you and Javier go? Quinn, when your credit cards get canceled and Amber finds out you've been lying about everything, who's going to let you crash on their couch?" The horror on their faces was almost artistic in its perfection. They were finally understanding that their greed hadn't just cost them their inheritance. It had delivered them directly into the power of the man they'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Raymond owns this house now, I continued, and he's expressed interest in renting out the bedrooms to reliable tenants. I mentioned that my children might be in need of housing arrangements soon, and he was very enthusiastic about the idea of having his stepchildren back under his roof. "You're insane," Trevor breathed. "This is insane. We'll contest the sale. We'll prove you were mentally incompetent when you signed the papers." "With what evidence? Patricia's guardianship papers haven't been filed yet. Dr. Henderson's report states that I'm fully capable of independent living and financial decision-making. I've been recording our conversations for weeks, so I have documentation of every lie you've told about my condition." I pulled out a small digital recorder from my purse, including Quinn's fabricated stories about confusion episodes and Trevor's fictional medication incident. All three of them went completely silent. "You've been recording us?" Natasha whispered. "Every visit, every phone call, every attempt to gaslight me about my own mental state. Amazing how different those conversations sound when you play them back, isn't it?" Patricia was frantically gathering her papers, clearly realizing that she'd walked into a family warfare situation that had nothing to do with elder law. "I think I should leave. This appears to be a private family matter." "Oh, don't go yet, Patricia," I said cheerfully. "Raymond should be here any minute, and I think you'll find his perspective on guardianship very interesting." As if summoned by my words, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Raymond's silver Mercedes in my driveway, now his driveway, gleaming in the Arizona sun. "Mom, please," Quinn said, panic creeping into his voice. "Don't let him in. We can work this out. We can forget about the guardianship thing. You can what? Continue pretending to love me while planning to steal my life? Continue lying about my mental state while plotting to take my house?" I walked toward the front door. "I think that ship has sailed, honey." I opened the door to find Raymond standing there with a bouquet of flowers and a triumphant smile. He'd dressed for the occasion in an expensive suit that made him look like a successful businessman rather than the psychological bully I remembered. "Judith, sweetheart," he said, kissing my cheek in a gesture that made my skin crawl but served the purpose of horrifying my children. "And my dear stepchildren, it's been far too long." The three of them looked like they'd seen a ghost, or worse, like they'd seen their worst childhood nightmare come to life. "Raymond," Trevor said, his voice barely controlled. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" Raymond laughed, stepping into the living room like he owned it, which technically he now did. "I want to welcome you all back to the family home. I understand you might be needing places to live soon, and as your new landlord, I'm prepared to offer very reasonable rates." "We're not living here," Natasha said firmly. "We're not living anywhere near you." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, sweetheart," Raymond said, settling into Carl's old recliner like he belonged there. "You see, your mother and I have been having some very interesting conversations about family loyalty and mutual support. She's told me all about your financial situations, and I've told her all about my plans for this property." He looked around the room with obvious satisfaction. "I'm thinking of turning it into a multi-generational family compound. Plenty of space for everyone, and I can keep an eye on your mother's condition while you all get back on your feet financially." "You're not keeping an eye on anything," Trevor snarled. "Mom, this is exactly what we were trying to protect you from. Can't you see that he's manipulating you?" I laughed, actually laughed, at the irony. "Trevor, honey, the only people who have been manipulating me are standing in this room. Raymond might be many things, but at least he's not pretending to love me while plotting to have me declared incompetent." "But he's going to take advantage of you," Natasha cried. "He's going to control your life." Unlike your plan to control my life through legal guardianship? The comparison hit them like a physical blow. They'd been so focused on protecting themselves from Raymond's influence that they'd become exactly what they claimed to fear, people willing to exploit my vulnerability for their own gain. Besides, I continued, Raymond and I have an understanding. He gets the house he's always wanted, and I get the satisfaction of watching my ungrateful children learn what it feels like to be powerless. Mom, Quinn said, tears starting to form in his eyes. We're your children. We love you. No, I said quietly. You love my money. You love my property. You love the inheritance you thought you could steal by having me declared incompetent. But you don't love me, because people who love each other don't lie and manipulate and gaslight each other the way you've been doing to me for months. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. I think it's time for you all to leave. Patricia, your services won't be needed after all. My children can contact Raymond directly about rental arrangements. As they filed out in stunned silence, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd won this battle decisively, but the victory had cost me something precious, the illusion that my children were good people who genuinely cared about my well-being. Raymond lingered after the others had left, and I saw something in his eyes that made me remember why I'd divorced him in the first place. That was even better than I hoped, he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of manipulation. Now, about our living arrangements. I held up my hand to stop him. Raymond, before you get any ideas about this being a reconciliation, let me be very clear. I used you to teach my children a lesson, just like they tried to use guardianship to steal my assets. We're even now. His smile faltered slightly. But Judith, we could be a team again. Think about what we could accomplish together. What we could accomplish is you leaving now before I call the police to report harassment. He studied my face, probably trying to determine if I was bluffing. After a moment, he nodded slowly. All right, sweetheart, you've made your point, but this house is mine now, and I'll be moving in next week. I hope you're prepared for what that means. After he left, I stood in my living room, now Raymond's living room, and realized that I'd won the battle, but possibly lost the war. My children had learned their lesson about greed and manipulation, but I'd traded one form of control for another. The difference was that this time I'd chosen my prison deliberately, and somehow that made all the difference in the world. 6 months later, I was sitting in a beautiful high-rise apartment in downtown Phoenix, sipping morning coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, when my phone rang with a number I'd been expecting for weeks. It was Trevor, and the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. Mom, we need to talk. All of us, please. I'd moved out of the house, Raymond's house, exactly 2 weeks after that devastating confrontation in my living room. Not because he'd forced me out, but because I'd accomplished what I set out to do. And staying there any longer would have been like remaining in a trap of my own making. The transition had been surprisingly liberating. My new apartment was modern, secure, and required zero maintenance. I had a doorman, a fitness center, and a community of active seniors who appreciated my company without any ulterior motives. For the first time in years, I was living entirely for myself. But the real story was what had happened to my children during those 6 months of consequences. Trevor had indeed lost 2 of his investment properties to foreclosure, exactly as my private investigator had predicted. Desperate to avoid losing his primary residence as well, he'd swallowed his pride and approached Raymond about renting rooms in the family home. The arrangement had lasted exactly 3 weeks. Raymond, it turned out, had very specific ideas about how his household should be run. Trevor and his family found themselves subject to rigid rules about noise levels, guest policies, and shared space usage. When Trevor protested about the unreasonable restrictions, Raymond simply reminded him that he was a tenant, not a family member, and tenants who didn't like the rules were free to find accommodations elsewhere. "He made us feel like prisoners in our own childhood home," Trevor had complained to Natasha. "Every meal had to be eaten together at his schedule. He monitored our phone calls. He even had opinions about how Melissa dressed the twins." But the final straw came when Raymond announced that he was considering marriage proposals from several women he'd been dating, and his new wife would need Trevor's family to relocate to make room for her children. Trevor had moved his family into a cramped rental house in a neighborhood he'd once considered beneath his standards, and his real estate business was slowly recovering under the weight of bankruptcy proceedings and damaged credit. Natasha's situation had been even more dramatic. After being evicted from her apartment, she'd reluctantly accepted Raymond's offer to move into her old bedroom with 15-year-old Javier. She'd convinced herself it would be temporary, just until her divorce settlement issues were resolved, and she could afford something better. Raymond had been initially welcoming, even offering to help with Javier's school expenses, but within weeks, his help had come with strings attached that felt disturbingly familiar to Natasha's childhood experiences. He'd started questioning her parenting decisions, criticizing her work schedule, and making comments about Javier's attitude and behavior. When Natasha tried to set boundaries, Raymond reminded her that he was providing free housing for her and her son, and ungrateful tenants could always be asked to leave. The breaking point came when Raymond announced that Javier needed more masculine influence and began implementing disciplinary measures that crossed every line Natasha had spent years drawing to protect her son from toxic authority figures. She'd fled to a women's shelter with Javier, then gradually rebuilt their lives with the help of social services and a victims' advocacy group. They were now living in subsidized housing while Natasha worked 2 part-time jobs and finished a nursing degree that would give her financial independence. "I never realized how much his control tactics had shaped my relationships with men," she told her therapist. "Moving back into that house was like stepping back into my teenage nightmare, except this time I had my son to protect." Quinn's experience had been the most psychologically devastating. Always the most sensitive of my children, he'd been the one most damaged by Raymond's psychological manipulation during his formative years. Moving back into that environment as an adult had triggered panic attacks, insomnia, and a depression so severe that Amber had insisted he seek professional help. "It was like he could smell my weakness," Quinn had explained to his counselor. "Every insecurity I'd spent years overcoming, every fear I'd learned to manage. He knew exactly how to resurrect all of it." Raymond had offered Quinn work doing graphic design for his various business ventures, but the projects came with impossible deadlines, constant criticism, and payment schedules that kept Quinn perpetually dependent. When Quinn tried to take on outside clients, Raymond claimed it violated their exclusive agreement and threatened eviction. The psychological pressure had become so intense that Quinn had eventually suffered a complete breakdown, requiring hospitalization and intensive therapy. Amber had moved him into her apartment during his recovery, and they were now planning to relocate to Colorado, where Quinn could start fresh without the constant reminder of his childhood trauma. "I spent so many years thinking I'd gotten over what he did to us," Quinn had written in a letter he'd sent me during his recovery. "But being back in that house, under his control again, made me realize that some wounds never fully heal. They just wait for the right trigger to reopen." The irony, of course, was that my children's suffering had been entirely self-inflicted. If they'd approached my diagnosis with genuine love and concern, instead of greed and manipulation, none of this would have happened. If they'd trusted my judgment instead of trying to undermine my competence, I never would have felt the need to teach them such a harsh lesson. But perhaps the most surprising development was what had happened to my relationship with Raymond. 3 months after I'd moved out, he'd started calling me regularly, suggesting dinner dates and weekend trips, clearly believing that our business arrangement had been the first step toward romantic reconciliation. "Judith, we make a great team," he'd said during one particularly persistent phone call. "Look how effectively we handled your ungrateful children. Imagine what we could accomplish if we joined forces permanently." That's when I'd realized that Raymond's eagerness to buy my house hadn't been about nostalgia or real estate investment. It had been about getting close to me again. He'd seen my vulnerability as an opportunity to rebuild the control he'd lost when I divorced him 16 years earlier. But Raymond had made the same mistake my children had made. He'd underestimated my intelligence and assumed my dementia diagnosis made me weak and manipulable. "Raymond," I'd told him during that final phone conversation, "I used you to teach my children a lesson about greed and manipulation. The lesson is over. If you continue to contact me, I'll file for a restraining order." "You can't be serious," he'd said, his voice taking on that threatening tone I remembered so well. "After everything I've done for you? Everything you've done for me? You mean buying my house at above market value and providing me with enough cash to live comfortably for the rest of my life? Thank you. That was exactly what I needed." The silence that followed told me he was finally understanding that he'd been played just as thoroughly as my children had been. "You planned this," he said slowly. "From the beginning, you planned this." "I planned to protect myself from people who wanted to exploit my illness for their own gain," I replied. "The fact that you all walked into that trap so willingly says more about your character than mine." I'd hung up and immediately changed my phone number. 2 weeks later, I'd heard through neighborhood gossip that Raymond was trying to sell the house. But the market had shifted, and he was having trouble finding buyers willing to pay what he'd paid me. He was stuck with a property he'd overpaid for, in a neighborhood where he had no friends, holding memories of a family that wanted nothing to do with him. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. Which brings me back to that phone call from Trevor on a beautiful Wednesday morning in October. "Mom," he said, his voice humble in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. "We know we messed up. We know we hurt you, and we know we destroyed your trust. But we're hoping maybe we can find a way to rebuild our relationship." I set down my coffee cup and looked out at the city where I'd lived most of my adult life, thinking about second chances and forgiveness and the difference between justice and mercy. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Family therapy," he said. "All of us together, with a professional mediator. We want to understand how we got so lost, how we became the kind of people who would try to steal from their own mother, and we want to find our way back to being the family Dad raised us to be." I thought about Carl and what he would want for our children. He'd been disappointed by their greed, but he'd never stopped loving them. He'd believed that people could learn from their mistakes and grow into better versions of themselves. "There would have to be conditions," I said. "Anything," Trevor said quickly. "First, you each need individual therapy to address whatever drove you to see me as a target rather than your mother. Second, complete financial transparency. No more lies about your situations or manipulative attempts to access my resources. Third, acknowledgement that my dementia diagnosis doesn't make me incompetent, and my medical decisions remain my own." "Done," he said without hesitation. "And fourth," I continued, "you need to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. You showed me who you really are when you thought I was vulnerable. It's going to take time, maybe years, to rebuild the trust you destroyed." "We understand," Trevor said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "Mom, we just want the chance to earn your love back." "You never lost my love," I told him, and realized as I said it that it was true. You lost my respect, my trust, and my willingness to tolerate your manipulation. But I never stopped loving you. That's why what you did hurt so much. We talked for another hour about logistics and expectations and the long road ahead of us. When I finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope for my family's future. The lesson my children had learned was harsh but necessary. They discovered that greed could cost them everything they actually valued. They'd learned that treating family members as obstacles or resources rather than people would ultimately leave them isolated and alone. They'd found out that assuming someone's weakness could blind you to their strength. But the lesson I'd learned was equally important. I'd discovered that I was stronger than my illness, smarter than my age, and more capable than anyone, including myself, had given me credit for. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices, even when watching them suffer breaks your heart. My dementia might progress over the coming years, and there might come a time when I truly do need care and protection. But that time isn't now, and when it does come, I'll face it with the knowledge that I spent my final years of independence living on my own terms, not as a victim of other people's greed or assumptions. The house where I raised my children is gone, sold to a man who represented their worst fears and my most painful memories. But perhaps that's fitting. Sometimes you have to burn down the old structures to build something new and stronger in their place. I'm 64 years old, I have early-stage dementia, and I just outsmarted 3 able-bodied adults who thought they could steal my life from under me. I'd say that's a pretty good day's work. The real treasure was never the house or the money. It was the respect and dignity that no one can take from you unless you give it away. And I'm never giving mine away again. Some battles are worth fighting, even when the weapons are lawyers and legal papers and family members who've forgotten what family really means. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes the most powerful thing an older woman can do is remind everyone around her that underestimating her intelligence is the first step toward losing everything they thought they could take. My children wanted to steal my house. Instead, they gave me back my power. And that's worth more than any property deed could ever be.